in 2007, they passed a regulation known as GASB 70, GASB 45, and they said that municipal organizations should discontinue recognizing the cost of retiree health benefits on what they call a pay-as-you-go basis. And pay-as-you-go basis means a bill comes into the city, and that's what the city would recognize as its expense for retiree health care. And what the Accounting Standards Board wants municipal organizations to do is to say that the cost of providing health care is really deferred compensation, and it should be recognized over the term that an employee actually works for that municipal entity. And so that kind of transforms the way the city of Warwick accounts for its health benefits that it's going to pay for the retirees. And so every year what we're doing here is we're accruing a little piece on an actuarial calculation of what we expect to pay for somebody when they retire. And so
it's not to interrupt you, but just so we're clear, for example, when we have pensions, we fund our pensions and we have deficits. And what the government accounting office said was many, not just Warwick, but many cities and towns were not funding these liabilities. And we don't fund this at all. So this is, as you said, an accrued liability that goes out into the future that you can't just pay for at once because you wouldn't have enough to operate the city.
Fair point made. The accounting standard doesn't require the actual funding of the liability. I'm glad you mentioned that. And so what happens is, within the city, they recognize the expense that's a future expense for the future retirees, but they only pay what comes in on the bill. And so what happens is this obligation grows exponentially every year. And I'll show you the mechanics of how that happens as we go through the report. And another thing that differentiates this from a pension is the fact that because it's unfunded, we end up having to discount future benefit payments at a much lower rate, and so the obligation increases significantly. And unlike a pension fund as well, the cost of health care, for most people would recognize that double-digit inflation is common with respect to health benefits. That's something else that the city absorbs. So the city absorbs the potential future inflationary costs, whereas with pensions, if there's any cost of living adjustment, it's capped, and it's usually pretty small. And so,
can you explain the discount rate to everybody?
Sure. The discount rate is essentially a percentage rate that's applied to the future obligation, where we say, if you owe $1 million in benefits to a particular employee, how does that come back to present value? And it's basically based on the assumption that you would invest a certain sum of money every year so that you would have that future value at the time you have to make the payment. And so that discount rate is what we use to bring it back to present value. In the case of the city, we're using a 4% discount rate, which is relatively arbitrary, and GASB 45 allows an arbitrary discount rate.
But we don't have any investments.
There is no investment.
So we shouldn't expect any rate of return of 4%.
Correct. And so,
but it's in the report. As if we would get a rate of return.
Correct. It's in the report as if you would get a rate of return.
So just so we're clear, we're expecting a 4% rate of return on no savings.
Correct. So you're absolutely right.
So essentially what I'm hearing is we are basing this plan on an anticipated rate of return of 4% of nothing. So in fact, aren't we starting in the hole 4% every year?
I would say you're starting in the hole 4% every year at a minimum.
At a minimum.
That's a good point. So I didn't write the rules, all right? And
don't misunderstand. This conversation is at you, not to you, or vice versa. So you, not at you.
So what I want to say though is you have to have some sort of an estimate, right? I mean, in essence, this entire report is an estimated obligation, and you really, if you wrote a check right now for what you think you owe, it'd probably be a different sum when the payment stream is paid out, no matter what happens, because assumptions change and vary as we go through time. But one of the things I want to point out is that the accounting profession recognizes the inequity and probably the arbitrary aspect of the discount rate, and so they penned a new accounting standard and that'll be effective the next time the city does the report. And one of the things that the accounting profession did was they said, you know, an arbitrary discount rate is almost as useless as a discount rate on an unfunded liability. But they said that it should be at least tied to something that's meaningful. And so in the next go-around, we'll see a discount rate that's tied to the 20-year AA municipal bond. And right now, that's around 3.3%. So at least it's based on something versus some arbitrary number. So with that said, 4% I think is universal. I don't necessarily agree with it, and I don't necessarily think it gives you a target, but it gives you some sort of an estimate.
Right, excuse me.
Yes, sir.
I hope you don't mind if we interject as we go
Please do.
along. So, you said that you do not necessarily agree with it. Given Warwick's situation where we pay as we go, and we are, as I put it, starting off 4% in the hole, you said a minimum of 4% in the hole, would you recommend doing it at all?
Doing what?
Not necessarily recommending it. Would you recommend not doing that 4% discount rate?
Well, you know, I think one of the things that I'd like to point out to you as we kind of get into the meat and potatoes of the report is that a 1% adjustment to the discount rate equates to about a 15.5% adjustment in the liability. And so there's an inverse relationship. So what we would be doing here, if we were to really kind of dial this in a little better, is we'd be dropping the discount rate to sub 1%. And so you'd be increasing your liability probably 50%. So for purposes of your financial statements, which this exercise is designed to do, it's really just to give your financial statement auditor something that they can put on your balance sheet and decide whether or not they can opine on it. I think 4% works. But if you're really looking to do long-range forecasting and say how much money should you be setting aside and what is the real financial condition, I would say that modifying the discount rate, taking 3 basis points away from it and increasing it 50% would be something that I would have in the back of my mind. When I was preparing for our discussion, I looked at some of what we call the individual results. And so when we do the actuarial study, we look at each and every person that's in the plan, and we can see the actual results for each person. And so, for example, a typical firefighter obligation using the assumptions in this report and the costs that are in this report has the present value of the obligation for one firefighter is $568,000. So how many firefighters are here in the town?
Over 200,
Okay.
close to 220.
So you can see how what seems to be at one point in time a really relatively insignificant benefit has now become a really significant obligation. And so that's just the mechanics of healthcare inflation. I can't remember the last time that we didn't have double-digit inflation. And so, again, that goes into your plan. You're absorbing the cost. And so that's one of the things that makes this more expensive. And so when I think about how you can potentially contain the cost, one of the things that I think about is putting a cap on the benefits and saying to the retirees that, you know, when you walk out the door, if it's costing the city $20,000 a year to give you benefits, that's what we'll pay. And that's what we'll pay for the next, in the case of some of the uniformed employees, it could be 60 years. You will pay $20,000. But if you roll out $20,000 and inflate it over 60 years, the sum of money is enormous. And so that's one of the things you need to be thinking about. We have a significant amount of business that we do in the state of New Hampshire, and one of the things that you'll see in the state of New Hampshire is if you retire from any place, all they give you is access to benefits, which means you can buy them from Cobra. Yeah, Cobra, which is actually not a bad deal. It's better than some of the health exchanges. So you have access to a group health insurance benefit, but you pay the whole cost. And that ends at age 65. And so one of the things that you also see in some of the municipalities that have gotten an ability to sharpen the pencil is that when someone turns 65, they get cut off from the plan. And if you look in the report that we did for the school, you'll see that they have 1,200 employees with a $22 million liability because they cut benefits off at 65, and they also have a really, really narrow benefit window for most of their employees. They pay the benefits for 3 years, maybe they don't pay them for life. I mean, I've seen municipalities, to answer your question as well, where if you started as a police officer at 20, you could leave at 35. You and your spouse get benefits for life. Should you become deceased, your spouse who never rendered a day of service to that municipality will get benefits for the rest of her life. So it's all over the place. The other thing that I thought was significant too was there were some benefit changes that were made by the city a couple of years ago where they drew the line at 2012. And so they changed the term of service from 20 years to 25, and they upped some retirement ages. And one of the things that I noted, and I think it's important to know, is I mean that's an aggressive move because it's never easy to adjust benefits or take anything away from anybody. But that savings, that particular person, if we compared the $558,000 to that person who now has to work in an extra 5 years, equates to $20,000 in savings. So it's really a drop in the bucket. So if you're really looking at how to address this, it's capping it and it's curtailing it when somebody reaches a certain age and then limiting spouse access.
Yeah, and Ray, just so we're clear that the spouses are not covered for school employees.
I'd have to look at my report, but if you have that in front of you and know that for a fact, then great. Okay. All right. So the present value of the future benefits that the city's obligated to pay in 2016 is $366 million. And so what we do is we say how much of that is actually earned by the folks that are either retired or active earning it right now. And so the accrued obligation is $272 million. The annual cost of providing those benefits as measured under this accounting standard is $24,800,000.
That's the annual required contribution?
Sorry, that's the annual required contribution. The annual OPEB cost is $22,900,000. Thank you for pointing that out. And then what the city actually pays in comparison to its annual OPEB cost is $8.1 million. So if we go back to the days pre-GASB 45 regulation, the expense would simply be $8.1 million, but now it's $22 million because we're recognizing an accrual for future benefits. And so this year our net OPEB obligation increased by $14.8 million, and so on your statement of net assets, also your balance sheet, whatever you want to refer to it as or think of it as, your total liability that we'll present this year is $125,493,000. And so that's when credit agencies and folks are looking at your balance sheet, that's what they're going to see. That's the big number.
Even though the present value is 366.
Correct. We'll never show the present value on the financial statements. All right. And the reason why we don't reflect the present value is because we've yet to. That's a future cost. So
we'll never be able to pay this off. We'll continue to go in the hole.
I think that's pretty evident in the numbers because
it's a fair statement.
Yeah, the magnitude of the numbers are huge. So GASB 45 likes us to show 10 years of benefit payments. And so what we're saying here is that in year 2016, we started $8.1 million.
Does that mean that that's what we actually pay out?
That's
2016.
Correct. That's a projected
amount that we're going to pay this year for healthcare.
Correct. Pay as you go, right? So the bills, we're projecting that your bills are going to be $8.1 million this year.
And that's just for retirees?
Retirees, yeah.
Okay. And in 2025, what is the cost going to be?
2025, we're projecting that your cost will be $13.1 million.
Okay. I'm looking at the cumulative.
The cumulative is, yeah, between now and 2025, you're going to need $100 million to pay retiree health insurance bills as they come in. That's what we're really trying to say. And I think that's...
So, are you saying that in 2025, when you say cumulative, you're adding up every year?
Correct. So, as you can see in the first year, we got $8 million, then we add another 8, we're at 16. It just kind of rolls year to year. It's an illustration. This doesn't line up with your financial statements, but it's really designed for the purposes of your auditors in terms of whether or not they can opine on this and whether they feel like they can rely on us. Because the auditors look at this and their heads spin and they say, well, you delegated this to a specialist. Did the specialist do the right work? Can we rely on that for purposes of giving an opinion on your financial statements?
So whoever's in office in 2018 is going to see a significant downgrade, I would assume, on the value of the bonds.
It's possible. I mean, that I really can't tell you. I don't know what the bond rating folks think about. This GASB 45 thing has been around for a decade now, and
some point, we're already at the point of no return, as you said 2 years ago.
Yeah, something else has to change. I mean, the tax base could grow. I mean, and that's the only other thing, right? And that's one of the things that I think municipalities have hung on to with respect to these benefits, because the private sector has gotten rid of these things a long time. And the municipalities kind of hang on to it because they have that taxing authority. But as you said before, there's a 4% cap, and then there's also, public tolerance for how high they can go.
This is only for health benefits, has nothing to do with what they receive for their retirement pay?
Correct. Absolutely nothing.
Oh, shit.